This happened when I was in high school. It had been a few weeks since the new school year had started and I was new to the school. But I had already made a few friends and was eager to make more, so I socialized a lot in hopes of making more friends. Since I was new, I was still not entirely familiar with the facilities, and one day I went to school and got lost while looking for the room where I would have an algebra class. This is where I met the boy who would eventually become my stalker. He showed me around and helped me get to the class I was supposed to go to. On the way we chatted, and at first I thought it would be nice to have him as a friend. A week went by, and I had made a few more friends at this point, so I wanted to hang out with them as much as I could. I felt a little bad that my other little friend was a bit of a loner, so I invited him to hang out with us. He didn't talk much at first, but after a while he finally opened up to me and then wouldn't shut up about anything. He would mostly talk to me, and as the days went on he started asking me for advice about life and all that, and I was happy to help, until he started asking me to pet his head like a dog and make him wear a leash. It was a little strange, but I saw it as a joke, and I obliged. But that's something I should never have done. After that, he started calling me mistress. I asked him not to do that and told him I wasn't comfortable with that behavior, but apparently it was too late to fix things. He started skipping his classes, and instead would walk into mine and stand there with me all the time. He started following me everywhere and all day long. Even when I went to the bathroom, he wanted to come in too. I asked him to stop many times, but he refused, so I tried to get the school involved to get his attention for his inappropriate behavior towards me. But according to the school, I needed to have proof of the harassment. I certainly didn't have it as such, i.e., pictures, videos, or messages and stuff. But I found it kind of annoying because even many of my teachers kicked him out of my classes and several of them affirmed it in front of the principal. However, still, nothing happened. After that episode, his behavior only got worse. He started to become more aggressive. One day I asked one of my friends to help me with a homework assignment. He heard this from around the corner and didn't like it. So he started picking on my classmate and even pushed him against the lockers. From there, he pretty much fought and harassed every guy he talked to. Some girls would probably find this flattering, but I found it annoying, immature, and to some extent, abusive. I tried to tell him that he shouldn't take such attributions because we were just friends, but his exact words were, "They don't deserve you. They are worthless compared to my mistress." Then I yelled at him to leave me alone. I felt bad, because I was pretty hard on him, but I was sick of his persecution, and if he wanted to act like a dog, I was going to treat him like one. I thought I had finally broken free from that cycle, because after that he finally stopped following me, until one day I found this letter in my locker. In the letter, my stalker expressed his dislike of men and his hatred of himself, and said that he must be evil for his mistress to treat him as cruelly as she was treating him, and that she should punish him as one punishes a pet for being a bad dog. It was a few pages long and very disturbing. In fact, it was the scariest thing I had ever read in my life, especially when I finished reading it, because I looked up and the first thing I saw was him, staring at me from across the aisle without blinking. He walked over to me, opened his phone and started showing me pictures of a cartoon character that looked similar to mine, with the same brown eyes and curly hair. Then he tried to give me a leash and asked me to come with him. At that point, I ran far away from him and didn't stop until I got to the principal's office with the letter in my hand. He reviewed the letter and finally had the evidence he needed, so this time he did agree to intervene. The principal got the police involved, and soon after a restraining order was placed against him. He was summoned to court and forbidden to come within 50 feet of me. I thought that was enough, that finally the nightmare was over, but I was very wrong. About a month after that, I was sitting in my room one night while doing some homework. Then I heard a scratching at the window, looked over, and upon seeing what was on the other side, I was completely paralyzed with sheer terror. My stalker was standing right outside my bedroom window. He had a dog collar around his neck and a leash was hanging from him. He was staring intently at me through the glass. His face then twisted into a disgusting grin before he licked the surface of the window and ran away. I snapped and ran outside to wake my parents, who called the police. When the police showed up, I told them who he was and what he did. They collected the evidence from my window and arrested my stalker for breaking the restraining order. Fortunately, I moved out of that city a month later and never heard from my stalker again. I still have nightmares about it to this day. Being stalked was not romantic or fun. It was terrifying, shocking, and stressful, and the worst thing I have ever been through in my life. However, I truly hope it solved the serious psychological problems I had. Everyone grunted as the fire alarm began to sound. Ordinarily, we would all enjoy Mr. Graham's break talking about lines, planes, and equations, but it was a rainy, cold day for an April. Our windows overlooked a field 3 floors below, where we would be meeting. The class stood up to get ready to leave. Amy looked down my row and winked at me. She shook her head, but I could tell things were going well between us. If I could borrow my dad's car for the weekend and drive her somewhere. Crazy now that I think about it. Looking back, all I had in mind then was dating a pretty girl and trying to stay awake for another hour of geometry. I still have nightmares thinking about the school being closed that day, and it all started with that alarm. Before we could line up for the fire drill, someone outside the classroom yelled very loudly, and it had a ripple effect on all of us. Mr. Graham frowned, and then motioned for everyone to stay where they were. He walked to the door and poked his head down the hallway. Our classroom was silent, with only the occasional student whispering something, like my friend Klein, who whispered from the row of desks behind me, "I think it's real fire." "I don't know," I replied. But then there was another scream. This one was closer, just down the hall. Mr. Graham jerked his head back so fast that he slipped and knocked over a desk. Several students helped him up, peppering him with questions about what was happening. Graham ignored them as soon as he got to his feet, then pushed open the door and slammed it shut, turning the lock. "Everyone remain calm and get under your desks," Mr. Graham said, turning off the lights. I hesitated for a moment, but we could all see the terrified expression on our teacher's face, even in the darkened room. The only light coming in from the hallway dripped through the small glass window at the top of the door. We all slid under our desks, crouched or sat and knelt. The screaming started again, several voices this time, all close together. Kelly was sitting under her desk looking at me wide-eyed. What's going on? All I could do was shrug, because I had no idea either. I had been locked in once before when I was in elementary school, but this felt different. Suddenly there was a knock against the door that made it rattle in its frame. Some of my classmates gasped, one even laughed, though it was a forced laugh, probably an involuntary reaction brought on by nerves. Mr. Graham was crouched by his large desk, his eyes fixed on the door. He was feeling the surface of the desk as if searching for something. After a few frantic moments, I saw his hand wrapped around a pair of scissors. Another knock against the classroom door. Now there was a shadow filling the window. The glass was so foggy it was hard to make out details, but whoever was standing in the hallway was huge. I heard a groan from a few rows back, but it was too dark to see who it was. Just then, someone else hissed for them to be quiet, but ironically, the second noise was much louder than the first. But then another sound became apparent in the silence. It was the sound of the doorknob being squeezed and shaken hard. Someone was in the hallway trying to open the doorknob to enter the classroom. Carefully and slowly, I moved my phone from my pocket and dialed 3 numbers, but I didn't have time to say anything to the 911 operator, because as soon as the call connected, the door flew open. The person in the hallway must have kicked the lock through. Mr. Graham jumped up with the scissors held high, like the saddest spear in the world. But the huge man in the hallway hit him with a hard punch before the scissors could connect. With my eyes almost out of their sockets, I saw my teacher crash into his desk and roll across the floor shatteringly. The big man turned on the lights and everyone screamed in unison, Kelly among them. I had the opposite reaction, my throat closing tightly as if he was strangling me. The man was at least 6.5 feet tall and had a million tattoos that climbed up his neck to connect with deep scars that marked his face, making him incredibly creepy. He had no hair or even eyebrows, and was dressed in a bright orange jumpsuit, which could only mean one thing. He was a prisoner, or rather an escaped prisoner if he was standing in our classroom. Another man walked in behind him. This guy was smaller, but wore the same prison uniform. He reminded me of a ferret the way his little eyes kept clicking around the room. "We should take some of them and barricade ourselves in the gym," the small prisoner suggested to the big guy. The tall man shook his head and said, "At no time did the cops go upstairs. They got Bradley." The other prisoner grunted and then slammed the door shut, but it didn't lock. So he turned and asked the big guy, "Did you break the lock?" "Obviously," he replied. The big guy pushed Mr. Graham's desk against the door and then added a bookshelf and some chairs to form a makeshift barricade. While he was doing all that, the little prisoner snapped his fingers to get our attention. "Okay, kids, if you all listen and cooperate, you'll get home to your mommies and daddies." Kelly had moved back to sit next to me on the floor. I felt her hand tremble, and she grabbed mine coldly. She squeezed it, and I squeezed back. The large man walked to the center of the classroom. Up close, he looked harder and colder than before. A jagged scar crossed his right eye like a ditch, and I could see that the iris and pupil were blind and cloudy in that eye. The man was covered in muscle, and his shoulders and arms looked incredibly tense against his overalls, which were knotted and partially burned. The guy opened his mouth to speak, just as coils of smoke began to seep out from under the door. The small prisoner cursed and ran to Graham's desk looking for something, maybe a weapon. He looked terrified, like an animal caught in a trap. The big man with tattoos and scars, though he seemed calm, stared at the fumes coming in through the gaps in his barricade. When the smoke reached Kelly and me, we both started coughing. I later found out it was tear gas, and that the police were just outside the classroom door. All I knew then was that it was getting hard to breathe. My eyes were red and watery, so Kelly put her arms around me and I hugged her back. I lost track of the little guy, but never the other prisoner. The big man didn't cough once, just walked quietly toward the rows of windows. He stopped at the one closest to my desk. It was the same window I had been looking at 10 minutes earlier when the fire alarm sounded. The large prisoner turned and looked into the classroom once, and at that moment we made eye contact for an instant. The way he looked at me was so chilling that I still dream about those horrible eyes from time to time. I didn't think he wanted to hurt any of us. The truth is, he could have taken us hostage, just like the other one said, who by the way was now trying to hide under a desk. He could also have fought, but instead he opened the window. I was surprised he fit because of his enormous size. Apparently he was agile. The man began to slide out the open window one leg at a time. Maybe he thought he could survive the fall, but that wasn't easy. It was 3 stories. However, I've known some big guys who thought all those muscles made them invincible, and this seemed to be the case. The man didn't say a word and just jumped into the void. One moment he was there, and the next he was in the air. I shouldn't have looked, but I couldn't help it. A second later, the police burst into the room, knocking down the barricade, and tear gas filled the room. The little prisoner was screaming that he had surrendered, and while all that was going on, I went over to open the window. I shouldn't have. The big man was lying on the stone path that ran around the perimeter of the school. His arms and legs were bent at unnatural angles. So was his neck. A thin pool of blood was seeping into the grass, and I later discovered that it was 3 men who had escaped from the local prison that morning, killing 2 guards in the process. All were serving life sentences, but the big guy decided to finish early. My name is Edmund, and I am a school teacher. The institution I work for is located in an isolated area outside the city, and this incident occurred some years ago. I used to teach 10th grade. That day, the school was going about its normal routine until a vacancy announcement appeared. The application for a chemistry teacher was published in our school newspaper, and on the same day, a man came to interview for the position. His name was Benjamin. Benjamin showed up at the principal's office, and I was also present for the interview. This was his first day at the school, and I remember that he was wearing formal clothes, had glasses that looked very simple, and a large black bag over his shoulders. The principal asked him some routine questions to check if he was really qualified to fill the position, and to his satisfaction, Benjamin was very intelligent and answered every question appropriately and very fluently. So that same day he was hired and appointed as the new chemistry teacher. The next day he formally started working as a teacher. The day before, that is, the day of the interview, Benjamin and I were talking for quite a while, and from then on we became good friends. He used to greet me as soon as he arrived at school, and we both got along very well. A few days after he joined the teaching staff, we were having lunch in the teacher's lounge and his phone started ringing on the table. The number of a foreign country appeared on the screen, something I saw by pure chance because the cell phone was so close to me. Benjamin hurriedly covered the screen with his hand, got up and walked a short distance away before he started talking to whoever was on the other end of the line. He stood near the window, and his facial expressions had changed significantly. Now his frown was furrowed and his face denoted annoyance as if he was angry about something, but I didn't understand anything he was saying because he was speaking in another language. After about 5 minutes, he came back and sat down. I asked him, "Who called you? You seem upset." Benjamin replied, "My wife called me. She lives in another country and now wants to divorce me." "I'm sorry," I told him as I heard what was going on. This explained the change in his countenance. A few days later, he took the students in his class to the chemistry lab for their usual practice. Soon after, recess started, and all the children were in the cafeteria and in the garden, while all the teachers were also gathered in the teacher's lounge. But when I got there, I noticed that Benjamin was not there. I assumed he was still in the chemistry lab, so I headed there. And when I got there, I immediately noticed something strange. In this lab, there was a small storage room where the stock of chemicals and lab equipment was kept. This was normally closed and opened only when necessary. But at the moment I entered the room, Benjamin was closing it. I didn't think much of it. After all, he was the chemistry teacher and maybe there was some material he needed for some class or something. "Why didn't you come in for lunch, Ben?" "Oh, I was about to go, but some chemicals went down in the lab, so I was taking some from the storeroom." He then walked over to me by slipping his arm behind my shoulder and saying, "Let's go to lunch," as he lightly pushed me out of the classroom. When I returned to class after lunch, there was a lot of noise among the children. I told them to be quiet and asked them what was going on. Then one student said, "Sir, I can't find my friend Lewis." This surprised me, so I asked, "What do you mean? Are you sure he came to school today?" The student assured me that yes, he was here before recess. I was eating lunch and playing during recess, so I didn't pay much attention to him. But he wasn't with me, even at that time, said the boy. At that, there started to be a lot of noise coming from other areas of the school, and I immediately ran over there. I peeked into the hallway and there were several teachers gathered, almost all of them, but Ben was not among the group. So I asked what was going on and was informed that 5 students were missing. Obviously everyone was a little alarmed, so there was a lot of noise in the hallways. I decided to head to the principal's office and talk to him about it. I needed a little more information, as this was a rather unusual situation, but just as I was meeting with him, a loud racket of voices started to be heard that seemed to be coming from the front door. The front door of the school was very large and was kept locked during school hours so that students could not leave during school hours. At that moment, the principal and I looked at each other and decided to go outside to see what was going on. That's when we saw a scene that horrified us. 3 men were coming through the door with assault uniforms and long guns in their hands. Their clothes were black and their faces were covered with masks. As soon as they entered the building, they killed our security guard and immediately the chaos began. The principal ran to his office and announced over the loudspeakers that a group of terrorists had broken into the school and that they should close all the doors immediately. He also ordered all teachers to go to their classrooms, secure the doors, and take cover with their students. There were loudspeakers everywhere in the school, so this information reached everyone. I ran to my classroom with the principal himself, and all the students and teachers were running back and forth, trying to take shelter in their classrooms. But I could see through the glass window located at the top of the door that there were still 4 students outside. They were knocking door to door in the classrooms, but no one was opening for them. That's when I heard gunshots. I told the principal, "Take care of these kids and quickly call the police. I'll go out and get those kids here." I immediately opened the door and ran down the hallway to find the 4 students. I got close to them and motioned for them to come with me to my classroom. But before we could return, I saw one of the terrorists approaching down the hallway with his huge gun in hand. At that moment, I noticed that there was an open door at the end. It was the door to the lab, so I ran with the boys to it. We got in as fast as we could, and I secured the door by bolting it. But we also decided to set up a barricade of chairs and desks to block the door in case the terrorist wanted to break it down. As we stood there, we could hear the screams coming from other parts of the school, in addition to the gunshots. We were all completely terrified, and there was virtually nothing we could do but try to hide. I pulled out my phone to call the police, but the signal wasn't coming through. Maybe the terrorists had put jammers on the school so that no one could call the authorities. That's why there was no signal on my cell phone. Then, a terrorist came to our door and started banging frantically. He was trying with all his might to kick and punch the door down, but fortunately, due to the long history of school shootings that have occurred in the country, the owners of the institution had taken precautions, and these doors were made of reinforced steel and had security locks, which made them very difficult to open, once locked. Since it would be impossible to call the police, I began to look inside the room for things we could defend ourselves with if necessary. There were a lot of chemicals in the lab, so I began to search through them for something that might be useful to us. There was a chemical whose container had the words, "Do not touch directly." It is highly corrosive. I opened the bottle carefully and dropped a drop on the floor, and when I did so, a lot of hot smoke started to come out, so I knew it would do the trick. However, there was only one bottle on the shelf, so I decided to open the storeroom to look for more of the substance, but when I did, I got a big surprise. There were the 5 missing students, all with their hands and feet tied and duct tape over their mouths. I immediately called the other students to untie their classmates and began to search inside the warehouse for more vials of the substance. Fortunately, it didn't take me long to find them, so I took 10 vials and gave one to each of my students, while keeping one for myself, obviously. Meanwhile, the terrorist was still trying to open the door, and after shooting the lock several times, he finally managed to do so. However, as soon as he pushed the door open, we emptied all the vials of the chemical he had gotten hold of on him. And before he could react, he started burning and screaming desperately, trying to get rid of the burning. But it was useless because this seemed to be a very powerful acid, and the pain of the burns was so unbearable that he threw aside his gun and started rolling on the floor and screaming in a chilling manner until he eventually passed out. Once he was unconscious, I went over to him and removed his mask, and to my complete shock, it was Benjamin. I was in shock for a moment, but in the situation we were in, there was no time for paralysis, so I quickly grabbed his gun, having no idea how to use it. But fortunately, several of my students were fans of some sort of war video game, where the weapons are pretty much the same as in real life. So they did know how to use it and taught me. We then grabbed other bottles of that chemical and the gun, and left the lab to head towards my classroom and barricade ourselves in there with the rest of my students. But this time, ready to defend ourselves if these guys came to attack us. As I approached the door and started knocking, logically all my students started screaming from inside thinking they were the terrorists. But I told them it was me, and soon the principal opened the door, and we all went inside. I told the principal everything that had happened, and we stayed in the classroom on guard, until a few minutes later we began to hear the sound of sirens, and then the voice of an officer through a loudspeaker ordering the terrorists to surrender, because they were surrounded. A few minutes later, a group of policemen approached the classrooms and told everyone to get out, that the situation was under control. It was then that we finally came out of our classrooms and felt safe. What happened that day was a terrible tragedy. There were 16 fatalities among teachers and students, and at least 20 injured. Benjamin's 2 henchmen were killed, while he was taken to the hospital and treated for 2nd and 3rd degree burns, and was subsequently imprisoned, and will spend the rest of his life behind bars, and scarred from the deep burns he suffered. When Mr. Norris asked everyone in class to bring something old or historic from home, I immediately knew what he would present. My grandmother left me a record player. A huge thing, made of brass and wood along with a vinyl box. I mean, if we're talking retro stuff, this was a #1, so I thought it would be a hit. But that was before Alan showed up with that awful box, and I lived the worst day of my life. No one believes me if I tell them the truth, and it's hard to blame them. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't lived it, because I know I did. Alan showed up in class that day looking very proud of the relic he was holding. "Is this Latin?" Mr. Norris asked Alan as he pulled out the box. He smiled and shrugged. "I'm not sure, but I think it's been in my family forever. I found it in the attic." Norris turned the box several ways, trying to decipher what it might be. It was a little smaller than a shoebox and made of dark redwood with carved letters or symbols. The container shone as if it had been recently polished. To be honest, I found it fascinating, although most of the class was completely disconnected from the whole antique thing, and I don't blame them. It was too sunny outside and we were too close to summer vacation. Since most of us were seniors, this would be the last break before college. Who would feel like paying attention to an old wooden box? Mr. Norris raised the box to eye level. "Well, I read Latin," he said, "and I think this artifact Alan brought is very old." Alan smiled again, and I could tell he was happy to have the professor's attention. He wasn't the kind of guy who had many friends, as far as I could tell. Alan spent most of our classes sitting in the back row with his hooded headphones on, lost in his own world. But back to the box. I must say something about it was bothering me. There was a sinister vibe about the thing that didn't sit well with me. The wooden box had some sort of pin that you had to turn to open it, so Mr. Norris turned it, and when he did, I kept my eyes fixed on it to see what was inside. However, as soon as he turned the pin, he put it back in place without opening the box. "Some of the markings are faded," the professor said, "but I think I can figure it out from the context. It basically says there's an invisible man trapped in the box and there's a warning that you should never release it unless you're among enemies." "Hey guys, are we enemies?" the professor asked in a joking tone. "Depends on whether you let us skip tomorrow's test," I said, playing along. My answer brought a smile to our teacher's face and also to my classmates, but after the guffaws, he cleared his throat and read slowly in a language he didn't recognize. Latin, I guess. And after he kept turning the slab around for a long moment without opening it, the lid of the box opened by itself. Yes, as you hear it, it opened by itself. Alan frowned. "What the hell?" the professor exclaimed, and at that moment dark figures began to emerge from the box. At first they looked like black fingers, but then these shadows gradually took on consistency and became like a stream of viscous motor oil. These blended until they splattered on the floor and then separated into 20 or 30 shadowy creatures, each of which was maybe 3 feet tall, reminding me of little devils or goblins, but with no distinguishing features, just dark silhouettes. Some kids in my class screamed, but I was glued to my seat watching the monsters, wondering if it was some kind of trick. Maybe the box was a projector and they were holograms, but suddenly, one of those black things was on Alan, wrapping its long limbs around his chest like tentacles. The monster came up to Alan's face and stuck its fingers, or what appeared to be fingers, in his mouth and started to open it wider and wider, until I heard the tendons in his jaw pop. He was trying to scream, but the imp went in his mouth and there was only a wet gurgle, and after a second, Alan closed his mouth. We looked around the room calmly, as if he was someone else. We were all dumbfounded, even Mr. Norris, but none of us noticed another of the creatures climbing up the wall behind the teacher until it was too late. The thing jumped onto his back and, just like Alan, made its way into his mouth. Paralysis broke over the desks and class chairs flew through the air as we ran in terror into the hallway. Cries, screams, stumbling, people running back and forth, crashing into each other as if in a mad race. It was total chaos as those little monsters from hell jumped and crawled on whatever they could get their hands on. I made my way out of the room, pushing my way through the pile of frantic students, and the last thing I heard was Mr. Norris on the phone to the front desk. "Attention, possible threat." I heard him say they needed to lock down the school. My eyes widened like fried eggs at his words, because if they closed the school, we would be trapped inside with the monsters in the box. Suddenly, someone pulled a fire alarm and the kids came flooding down the hallway. "Go back to your classrooms," I shouted, fighting against the rush. Then the creatures invaded the entire hallway and all hell broke loose. The lights went out completely, and then the red emergency light bulbs came on. There were screams and monsters everywhere, dragging my classmates down and forcing their jaws open. Amidst all the madness, I managed to get into the janitor's closet and lock myself in there. Someone started banging on the door, but I simply curled into a ball and tried to cover my ears to block out the shrieking. The noise soon stopped, probably minutes after I entered the closet, but it felt much longer. I counted to 300 and then slowly opened the door. Now the hallway was empty. I walked a few steps beyond my hiding place and saw a shadow at the end of the hallway. It was still dark, and I could only see the red glow of the emergency lights, but I realized that whatever was casting that shadow, it was moving towards me. I considered diving back into the janitor's closet, but my original classroom was now closer. Besides, I hoped that was the last place the monsters would look, since that's where it all started. So I ran as quietly as I could and crouched down to the open classroom door, gently pressed the lock, and it turned with a very satisfying click. I let out a long sigh. The classroom was dark, and fortunately, Alan's wooden box was empty and lay on the floor still open. The room was cold and getting colder the closer I got towards the container. How could so many creatures get out of such a small place? But before I could get any closer, I heard the horrible rattling of someone trying to open the closed door. The rattling quickly turned into a scraping and then a slamming. I was trapped. I looked around desperately, but there was no way out, not even a window. My eyes fixed on the box, which was shaking, almost humming. Then a plan formed in my mind as the noise of the door trying to be opened continued behind me. I started to run towards the box, but every step I took felt like it was becoming impossible. It was like trying to run against the wind in a hurricane. My legs felt heavy, like I was trying to run buried in mud. It was as if the box was resisting my grasp, but I was still able to reach it. However, as I was about to close it, I heard a chorus of screams coming from the hallway. They were so loud and deafening that I had to cover my ears because I felt like my eardrums were going to rupture. I began to feel very dizzy, and before I knew it, I passed out. When I woke up, the lights were back on in the school. 2 paramedics were kneeling beside me, checking my vitals. They loaded me onto a stretcher despite my insistence that I could walk and took me to the hospital. I stayed there for the next 2 days, then they released me, and a week later, I was back in school. The first day I arrived, I looked at all my classmates and they seemed perfectly normal, talking and joking as usual. Also, Professor Norris was teaching his classes normally, as if nothing had happened. According to the school administration, all the chaos was due to a gas leak that caused some students to become severely intoxicated, which caused many to present symptoms such as dizziness, vomiting, and in some cases like mine and other classmates, supposedly hallucinations. I asked several of my classmates if they remembered the box incident, and many of them looked at me strangely and assured me that they did not remember any of it. No one seemed to remember the incident of the box and the monsters. I even asked Professor Norris, and he also denied that that ever happened. Instead, he claimed that he was never able to open the box because several of us started to feel sick, and that I specifically started screaming and running through the halls screaming something about monsters in a box, and then locked myself in the janitor's closet, where I was later found passed out. I looked at the teacher with wide eyes, and upon seeing my puzzled expression, he laid a hand on my shoulder and told me not to worry, because I wasn't the only one who had a similar reaction that day. However, I don't think it was a hallucination because I was intoxicated with the gas, and to this day I'm convinced that it really happened. I don't know what happened afterwards. I don't know why only I remember it, but I am sure that it really happened, and that somehow those monsters managed to erase everyone's memory. Hello, my name is Emma. At the beginning of September, I started my senior year of high school. I was a bit of a loner and generally kept to myself. I lived in a very rural area in upstate Washington, so it took me some time to drive to get there on time and not miss any classes. I remember there was a student named Rake who I really didn't know very well, but he never seemed to bother anyone. However, for some reason, He started acting very strange with me overnight. One day we were in a history class, and as I was copying my notes, something caught my eye from my peripheral vision. I turned to the spot and saw Rake staring at me from the desk on the far right of the front row. He said a few words to me, but I couldn't make out what he was trying to tell me, so I didn't give it any thought and just continued where I was. As the day progressed, I saw him in the hallways giving me nasty looks and making weird gestures, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I had too many things to take care of to waste time and energy figuring out what this strange guy was going on with me, so I did my best to ignore him and go about my business. Finally, it was the last period of the day and I was about to leave, but I stopped dead in my tracks when I noticed Rake at the end of the hallway, again staring at me. I acted like I didn't see him and tried to blend into a crowd of departing students, but as I walked out the door, he saw me get into my car. I remember looking in the rearview mirror and seeing him standing by the parking lot, watching me as I drove away. When I left the parking lot, I was a little worried and confused. I didn't understand what was going on with this guy. But on the way home, my aunt called me to go pick up some stuff at her apartment, so I headed over there and was chatting with her for a while, which distracted me and made me put aside the issue of Rake and his psychopathic behavior that day. By the time I got home, I had completely forgotten about it. But later that night, I received a text message from an unknown number that said, "I know where you live." I didn't know what to think, so I ignored it, thinking it was a spam message or someone who got the wrong number, and just kept working on my homework. A while later, I received another text message, but this time it was more alarming. It was a picture of me walking into my school. The number then sent another picture of me in the school hallway. Both pictures were taken from behind. Then another message came in, and this one really gave me the creeps. It was my home address. At that moment, I jumped out of my bed and my heart started racing. My parents weren't home at the time, so I was all alone. Scared to death, I quickly locked all the doors with keys, then went inside the house and closed all the blinds. The last window I reached was the living room window, but before closing it, I briefly looked out and saw a silhouette standing in my front yard. It was too dark to see who it was, but I closed the curtains and headed toward the basement. I entered the basement and waited there. An eerie silence settled there, as if something could happen at any moment. The silence was interrupted by the sound of the front door handle turning. Fortunately, it was locked, but the mere fact that someone was trying to get in was terrifying. 5 minutes later, I heard footsteps above me, and I got goosebumps, because that meant that whoever was outside had found a way into my house. I quickly hid under an old desk. I should have called the police when I had the chance, but I guess I really didn't think anyone could get in, and now I didn't want to reveal my hiding place. My worst fears were realized when I heard the basement door creak open. I could see the light from the upstairs hallway glow for a split second before it went out, plunging the basement back into darkness. Now everything was silent and pitch black. Then I heard a voice. "Hello?" It was Rake. "I know you're down there, I can see you. Come out now." I didn't know if he was lying, so I didn't move. Then he slowly walked down the stairs and slowly walked around the room. I could hear him throwing things and getting closer and closer until he stopped directly in front of the desk. My heart was pounding a mile a minute. All was silent again until Keith spoke. "Okay. I gave you a chance to make this easy, but now you've really got me mad." At that moment, my eyes got used to the darkness and I could see that Rake was holding a hammer in his right hand. Without thinking, I jumped out from under the desk and pushed him, causing him to fall backwards, then headed for the basement stairs, and as I did, I heard a resounding, "I'm going to kill you." And then, something flying across the room and crashing into the old man by the stairs. I guessed it was Hammer. As soon as I got upstairs, I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, then ran out the front door screaming for help. "Let me out!" I could still hear from the front yard. I immediately called the police and then my parents. It wasn't even 10 minutes later when I started hearing sirens in the distance. When the cops pulled up, I informed them that the man was locked inside the basement, but when they entered the house and opened the basement door, Rake was gone. He escaped by breaking a window. Turns out I had forgotten to lock the side door, and that's how Rake got in. But escaping wasn't going to get him away from the police. I knew who he was. So I gave the cops all the information and showed them the disturbing messages he had sent me earlier. 2 days later, I was called to the director's office. I was told that Rake had been arrested and would never be allowed to return to school. Fortunately, I never saw him after that. As for what his motives were, to this day I myself have no idea what bug bit him, although according to my psychologist, he probably had some kind of psychotic break and decided to act on a preconceived obsession with me. He is convinced that Rake suffers from some kind of undiagnosed disorder, but the truth of it all is that it is really scary. One day he seemed so serene and reserved, and the next he was in my basement trying to kill me with a hammer. I live in a very rural area of Ontario, Canada. It was early September and I was getting ready for my first day of school. Unfortunately, I was held back my senior year, so now I would be going back to high school when I was 19 years old. Since we lived in a very isolated area, the middle school and high school shared the same building. I had a study hall during first period, and when I walked in, I noticed a new student on the other side of the room. He stood out because, as I said, it was a fairly small community, so I went up to him and introduced myself. We shook hands and he told me his name was Chester. Apparently, he had just moved to the area, and I, being the friendly and hospitable Canadian that I am, showed him the school and the room where his next class was. As I was giving him a tour, I noticed that he seemed a little out of place. He started asking me questions that at first seemed harmless, like how long I had been there or where a certain classroom was. But then he started asking me some questions that seemed too weird, like asking for my home address, my phone number, and my Snapchat. Yes, that's how awkward it sounds. This took me completely by surprise, and obviously I didn't give him my home address or my phone number, but I figured what could it not hurt to give him my Snapchat. But this was a decision I would later regret. When the last period of the day came, I had English class. There were only 9 students in that class. As soon as I walked in, I took my usual seat in the second row, and that's when I looked behind me and saw Chester. He didn't notice immediately because he was too busy making out with a sandwich. I was flabbergasted. It was the most bizarre and disgusting thing I had seen to this day. Chester looked up, and that's when he realized I was there. Imagine being present at a murder trial and the defendant turns and looks directly at you. That should give you an idea of how uncomfortable I felt. He then motioned for me to come closer, but class was about to start, so I ignored him. 5 minutes later, I looked up from my book and noticed that Chester was now staring at me. The look in his eyes was predatory. He must have seen me as the next sandwich he was going to devour. Again, he motioned for me to walk towards him, but I paid no attention. I know a weirdo when I see one, and this one really did look like a most exotic specimen. So I ignored him and continued reading my book. Then my phone rang. I turned to look at the screen and realized it was a Snapchat message. And sure enough, it was from Chester. The message said, "Follow me." Follow him? Where am I supposed to follow him, and for what? "We're in the middle of class," I replied. At that instant, Chester got up from his desk and asked the teacher if he could use the restroom. The teacher nodded, and he then went out into the hallway. I wanted to see why he wanted me to follow him, so after about 5 minutes I asked the teacher if I could use the restroom as well. She nodded again, and then I left the classroom. As I stepped out into the hallway, I saw that Chester was about 50 feet away, walking very slowly. This guy was definitely weird. I kept a distance behind him so he wouldn't know I was there, but then he turned down the hallway that led to some storage rooms in the basement. I saw him open a door and he closed it behind him. Somewhat confused, I walked toward the door he entered and recognized it as the entrance to the school basement. Oh no, there was no way in hell I was going to follow him to that place, that's for sure. I just turned around, walked casually, and wandered back into the classroom. As I sat back down, my phone rang again. "Why didn't you go into the basement?" Okay, now I was completely freaked out, but seriously, what the hell was wrong with that guy? I thought the best thing to do was to stop stalling and tell him things straight, so I texted him, "Look, leave me alone, you scare the hell out of me." Then I blocked him. When I got home that day, I immediately started doing my homework, and by the time I finished it was around 11 p.m. I was home alone that night. as my parents were away on their anniversary trip and wouldn't be back for another 2 days. I was putting all my stuff away when I got a new Snapchat notification. Someone had added me as a friend, but it was from an account called, "Why didn't you go into the basement?" I knew it was Chester, who else could it be? So I blocked him. Not even 30 seconds had passed when I got another request. This time they called the account, "Why did you block me?" I blocked that one too, and then another one came in, and this time it was even more sinister. "Open the door for me," followed by a short video of the entrance to my house. When I saw that last one, I almost fainted. I couldn't believe Chester had figured out my home address. If I was scared before, now I was scared of whatever comes after that. I ran out of the room and scurried across the living room until I came to one of the front windows, which was covered by a large curtain, and very carefully looked out the front. That's when I saw him standing there on my porch, looking every which way. Chester stood there, motionless under the lamplight, and suddenly his eyes fell on the window. I immediately tried to hide by ducking under the edge of the wall, but I was sure he had already seen me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and suddenly I felt a shiver run down my spine. At that moment, I knew I had to act fast. Without making a sound, I moved away from the window and headed to my room. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 immediately. As I waited for someone to answer, I heard a thud coming from the front door. My body instantly tensed. I knew it was only a matter of time before he tried to break in, but by the work of heaven, the call connected right then and there. I quickly explained my situation to the operator and gave them my address. He told me the police were already on their way. I tried to remain calm, but it was difficult. Every second that passed, I felt that this psychopath was getting closer. And I was not wrong. At that moment, I started to hear footsteps down the stairs. I was starting to panic and ran to the door, jiggling the knob to make sure it was locked. Then I hid in the only place I could think of, under the bed, and covered myself with a blanket. I heard Chester's footsteps approaching my room, and the next thing was so fast I didn't see it coming. I heard a loud, sharp knock, followed by the door swinging wide open. I covered my mouth with my hands to keep from screaming and tried to keep my breathing under control, but this was even harder than trying not to scream. He opened the door to my room with one paw, just like that. Then he came in, and I could hear him moving around the room, but it was completely silent. I could only hear his footsteps and the sound he made as he opened drawers in the closet. Then he stopped right next to my bed, and I could hear his heavy breathing. At that moment, I closed my eyes tightly and prayed that the police would arrive soon. I was sure he would peek under the bed, and God knows what could happen. I didn't even know what his intentions were. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the front door, and Chester was startled. I could hear him blurt out a swear word under his breath and then run out of my room. But then I began to hear banging and screaming, and then silence. When I finally mustered the courage to come out from under my bed, I saw 2 policemen entering my room, and for me it was like seeing Jesus Christ himself in front of me. At that moment, I was breathing heavily as the officers helped me up. They took me to the living room, and there they corroborated that they had arrested Chester while he was trying to escape through the front yard. Apparently, he had tried to escape through the window, but had fallen and sprained his ankle. The next day after school, I went to the principal's office to report Chester. Honestly, I think he was a threat to both me and the other students, but here's the creepy part of the story. My principal told me that there was no new student named Chester, which means he must have snuck into the school somehow and mixed in with the other kids. What's worse is that none of the staff bothered to confirm if he was actually a new student. Fortunately, I never saw or heard anything about him again. He probably moved to another city as soon as he was released. Hopefully he did.